So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this talk with Tahirih Naylor-Thimm's Becoming the Parent Your Adolescent Needs. I was speaking earlier with Tahirih on the phone, and I could hear her children. So I know the sacrifice she's making tonight to be with us. It is never easy to be a working parent. I could also hear her husband helping. So I think that the home was a busy home, and we appreciate you taking this time from your family and including us all in your evening. We're looking forward very much to the talk. Is everybody on and can hear now? So I'd like to ask Tahirih to begin. This is part 2 of our series, and we're very excited. I feel like I am in a school that I wish I had joined 20 years ago, because today we're going to learn how to become the parent that our child needs. And I too am a mother, as you know, but my children are adult children, and I'm very excited, even at my age, to learn whatever tips Tahirih might offer to help that attachment grow closer. Before we begin, I just want to say that we had some very beautiful comments last night, and that we had a variety of alternative families. I think that really is a sign of our times. We had people that were merged families texting, emailing, and commenting. We had people that were adopted families. We had I think many races, many walks of life that contributed and were here to have some advice. I had some very heart-wrenching letters and comments later that all parents were feeling very relieved to find out that it's never too late to start or to encourage the attachment with their teens. So with that, I'll let Tahirih go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy. It's wonderful to be back with everyone. Thank you for coming for the first time or coming back again. You'll remember from last week, we began to speak about the role of attachment, the role of relationship, really the role of love, and the role that plays in our child's life, and how that helps them to grow and develop and become a capable, unique individual that can contribute to humanity. And so we went through talking about the roots of attachment, how a child begins to attach to us, how we build our relationship with that child over time. And we talked about a little bit about becoming the parent our child needs. So that's really the theme for tonight, is looking at what we do when we feel that our relationship with our child is not quite where we want it to be, how we can rebuild that relationship, and how we can ensure that we are the guide that our children turn to. So maybe I'll ask Taylor to start the slides, if you don't mind, Taylor. Great. You can go to the next one if you don't mind. So last week we talked about this. Oh, before I begin, I want to share that most of this information comes from studying with Gordon Neufeld, who's a developmental psychologist in Vancouver, who's done so much work on the role of attachment and relationship with our children. So you'll see him later tonight. I'm going to show a little clip of him speaking. So last week we talked a lot about this relationship, the role of attachment. And we also touched on the idea that when our children are in a strong relationship with us, when they feel secure with us, when they feel that we are their home, their compass, their guide, that allows them to emerge into their full potential. So the idea is we want to give 2 invitations for all of our children, but particularly for our adolescents as they're really coming into themselves, growing closer to adulthood. 1, that we are there to love and care for them, and that we will always be there to do that. And 2, that we welcome their whole self into relationship with us. So that means that we are capable of handling who they are, what they bring, their ideas, their opinions, their thoughts. We're not scared of that. We're not overwhelmed by that. In fact, we want to be able to talk with them about all of that. And I think the teenage years are a critical time for lots of dialogue and conversation about all these new ideas and thoughts that they may have. Next slide, please. So what happens though is that often we see that teenagers and children may fall out of attachment. And I think intuitively we all know when our relationship with our child is strong and good and when something's off. We can tell. We can tell that they're not quite looking to us in the same way. They're not looking in our eyes. They're not coming to us. So what may happen is that our child is facing too much separation from us. And this can be, a big long trip that we've taken that we're actually far apart from them, or it just may be the demands of daily life where we're running around so much and activities after school and work, and we just haven't had the time to sit and really connect with them. It may also be a result of them feeling rejected or betrayed by us, not feeling that they belong or they really care about us. Sometimes we can be a bit harsh in our punishments, in our tones when we're rushing through the day, and it may build up over time. And what happens is that in order for us to feel that we are close to somebody, we have to be able to be vulnerable with them. But if we don't feel that we can be vulnerable, then we put up defenses that sort of protect our hearts. And those defenses cause us to close off from one another. And this can be particularly true with a very sensitive child. Children who are more sensitive to your tone of voice, to any difficulties they face in life can shut down and become more defended more quickly. So we have to be even more careful with them. But the question is how we encourage them to be vulnerable, to share their range of feelings, to be able to feel sadness, feel happiness, all of that with us. But when we start to see that they're facing too much separation, that they're closing down, then we might say that they've sort of fallen out of attachment with us and we need to do something about that. Okay, next slide, please. So what happens when the attachment instincts go into reverse is we move from having a child who cooperates, who listens, who respects and accepts help from us, to one who is uncooperative, who's belligerent, who's rejecting, secretive, and disrespectful. And this is the case all through. So often the media, and I think culturally, we're taught that the teenage years, we have just these characteristics, right? They're uncooperative, they're belligerent, they're rejecting. I can remember being 13 and really not wanting to turn into a teenager because this was kind of the image of teenagers that I had been shown. But I don't think it's the way that it has to be. I think that when we can encourage our teenagers to be close to us and to express who they are in relationship to us, that we don't have to go through a full-on rebellious phase. And I'm sure many of you have wonderful examples of how you've avoided some of this. So the interesting thing is that when our child isn't in good relationship with us, they have strong counterwill. And counterwill protects them from listening to people that they're not attached to. And the best example I have of counterwill is if you can imagine being in line at a grocery store and somebody coming up behind you with their cart and just sort of accidentally pushing you a little bit with their cart. And your instinct is kind of just to push back, right? Like, what are you doing? Why are you pushing me? I don't know who you are, and I'm just going to push you back a little bit. So when our children are asked to do something or something is demanded of them by someone who they're not attached to, their response, and it's an instinctual response to protect them, is to push back. So we have to make sure that they're in relationship with us before we ask things of them, before we want them to do things. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. Next slide, please. So if you're not confident about your relationship with your teenager, you may begin to wonder, who or what is my teen attaching to? And some questions that you might need to ask is, who does he want to be with? Who is she loyal to? From whom does she seek comfort? Who does he feel most at home with? And who does she tell her secrets to? So this is a bit of a litmus test. Who are they turning to? Who do they want to be with? Who do they go to when they need comfort? And of course, there's waves of this. They're not always going to be in perfect attachment with us, but in general, we want our children to be coming to us. And if we can't answer, next slide, Taylor. If we can't answer that we are the answer, if we discover that we are not the answer to these questions, then we may see that our child is turning to fulfill his or her attachment hunger through attachment to their friends. So this is really a serious phenomenon that we're seeing so much right now, that children are very peer oriented, that they're turning to their friends to fill that attachment hunger. They're turning also to impersonal things like sports figures, celebrities, digital devices, video games, all of these things can sort of superficially fill that need for attachment. Next slide, please. So we're just going to listen to a 1.5-minute clip of Gordon Neufeld just speaking about this peer orientation. It's the top link, Taylor.
This is a very common problem of kids not listening to their parents when their friends are around, their peers are around. And it's an early indication, actually, that a child is beginning to replace parents with peers. This is what I call peer orientation, and it's a growing and escalating phenomena in our world today. It's so common, in fact, that we don't realize its insidiousness, that it is actually what was never intended, or nature never intended it. When peers matter more than parents, when a child takes his cues from his peers for how to act, for how to be, for how to think, for what's important, and when a child starts orbiting around his peers, that's the problem. The symptom is they won't listen to us, but we only attend to the person that we're attached to, and only when those attachment instincts are engaged. So this suggests not a behavioral problem, but a relationship problem. And so the wise parent will say, oh my goodness, I'm losing my child when they're with his peers. I need to do something about this to slow down the interaction, which we all need to do, to slow down the interaction, not to court the competition, and not to encourage it, and to strengthen the relationship. And there's also another thing that's very important with attention, is even if your child has a good relationship with you, you've got to be able to collect the eyes. You've got to be able to collect the attention before you have to engage them, before you interact. It's very simple. It's the essence of the greeting ritual. You get their eyes, you get a smile, you get a nod, and you make sure you get all of those things, and so you work for this. And then when you have it, you ask them to put away their clothes. You start interacting with them in ways to influence them and so on. Many parents simply operate out of their role, and they think, well, I can tell the child what to do simply because I'm dad or stepdad or mom or whatever it is, or teacher. That's not true. You have to actually collect before you direct. That little mantra can absolutely transform a home.
Thank you. I think we're a little bit in fast forward there, so hopefully you caught everything he said. But 2 points that I just wanted to highlight out of that is, one, this idea of who or whom our children are orienting around. He said this orbiting idea. So we want our children to be orbiting around us. We're like the sun, and they should be orbiting around the adults in their lives who are meant to be guiding them. But if we see that they're orbiting around their peers or around their video games or all these things, then we need to be responsible and take action to change that. And we can't be afraid to do that. That's part of our jobs. So the other interesting thing that he says there is that this is not a behavioral problem, this is a relationship problem. So often we think that we need to punish or really punish and discipline to stop these behaviors. But actually that can often make it worse because it increases the separation between us and our child. And what we want to do instead is address the relationship. So it's really looking at the core of the problem, which is whether our child is feeling like they're, in good attachment, if they're feeling loved and close to us. Next slide. So one of the other issues with peer interaction is that it can be a major source of wounding. Children and teenagers, their brains are still developing. They're not full adults. They're emotionally and spiritually not quite there yet. So they're not trying to keep your child safe. And they can be a cause of a lot of defenses being erected. So we want to be careful that our children don't have too much exposure to wounding experiences. And too much peer time can be very wounding for some children, for some not, but for some it can be really too much. So they can experience a lot of shame, the usual stuff that goes on with kids. They can feel very unsafe with them, and they can feel too much separation from their families and their central attachments. We also know that children often use separation against each other. I'm not going to be your friend anymore if you don't do what I say, which is very painful and hurtful for the child on the other end of that. We can even look at this whole phenomena of bullying and why bullying has become so bad in relation to this, that children are turning to their peers for their love and assurance rather than turning to their adults. So when a bully comes in and attacks them, it's one thing if they can go home and talk to somebody they love and care for, but if they can't go home and they don't feel that that is their safe place and all they have is their friends, then the bullying can get out of control. And we see things like suicides and all these other horrendous things that are happening to some of our children in our society today. Next slide.
Tahirih,
Yeah.
I have several people texting at the same time asking you, when you're saying children, you are meaning adolescents as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean our children, yeah. So the good news is that it is never too late to restore our attachment with our child. And we need to take responsibility for providing and cultivating the secure attachment, the roots that we talked about last week, on a daily basis. So in the same way that we provide nourishing meals for our family every day, we also need to provide this attachment nourishment our children need every day. Next slide. So let's go over a few points about how we can reclaim our relationship with our teens. And I will say child, but just know I mean your child. So the first one, and we talked a little bit about this last week, was that we need to assume responsibility for the relationship. It is not our child's job to make sure they're in good relationship with us. It is our job to do that. So we need to convey to our child that our relationship with them is more important than their conduct or their achievement. This can be hard, really hard, but that needs to be the message, that we don't love them only because they've achieved so much, or we don't love them only because they're well behaved. We love them because they're our daughter, and we'll love them no matter what, or our son. We also need to be careful about conveying the message that the child is responsible for contact and closeness with us. It's our responsibility to be close and to hold them close. We don't want to convey the message that our child is responsible for our feelings either. We're responsible, and we talked a lot about this last week, that we turn to our husband or our wife or our friends for support and encouragement, emotional support, but we don't want to turn to our children. They're not responsible for that. And then finally, we also want to convey to our child that nothing can sever their relationship with us, that we will be there no matter what, that we are there for them and will continue to be there for them. So this is a big one, and it kind of relates to this whole idea of being the caring alpha in the role. We see now that a lot of children are in alpha roles. And that's when you see the ultimate defenses up. So they're so defended that they can't accept any direction from another adult. They're always the boss. They're always in charge. They know what to do. But this isn't a role that a child should be playing or a teenager should be playing. They should be able to accept guidance from the adults in their lives. And they should be able to know to that relationship because they have to be able to rest in order to grow. They need to rest in attachment in order to grow. Next slide. The next one, Dr. Neufeld mentioned this in the clip that I showed you, is this very simple concept of collecting before you direct. And an easy way to think about it is if you imagine going to a party, which I'm sure we're all missing these days, but going to a gathering or a party and somebody's holding their, let's say, 10-month-old or 7-month-old baby. Most of us wouldn't go right up and just sort of take the baby and hold the baby. We would first go up to the baby and kind of see if we could catch the baby's eyes. If we get the eyes, then we might try to make a funny face and get them to smile. Then we might hold out a finger and see if the baby latches onto our finger. And then if all of those steps are taken and the baby, responds to us, then we might reach out our hands and say, can I hold her for a few minutes and hold her? But we wouldn't just grab the baby. And yet often when we're in a relationship with a child, like a mother or a father or a teacher or whatever it is, we kind of walk into the room and kind of ask things of them right away without going through a sort of a greeting process, a collecting process. And we don't even do this with our neighbors. If you're walking down the street, you sort of look at somebody, you say hello, you make sure you get their eyes, their smiles, their nods. So we always want to make sure that the first thing we do is attend to matters of relationship, that we engage. We make sure that they're looking at us, that they're smiling. We might say, oh, I like your shirt today. Red's my favorite color. And they'll nod and say, oh, that's nice, the teenager. With teenagers, it can be a little more challenging. Sometimes it's harder to get the eyes. Sometimes it's harder to get them to smile at you. but we have to try to do that work first. So the first work always is to attend to matters of relationship before we go on to ask them to do the dishes or straighten their room or whatever it is we want to do that day. And it does require us to slow down and make time for nurturing these relationships. But the payoff is huge whenever, and most of us probably intuitively do this most of the time. You'll see when you're engaging with, anybody else's child, you probably do it very intuitively. When I think we need to practice it more is with our own children, when they've been apart from us for a certain amount of time, even just when they've been watching TV or on the computer. We have to collect them again. We have to re-engage their attachment instincts to come back to us so then we can do our work. Next slide, please. The next important step is to bridge separation. So this is something that you probably also do instinctually, but it's to point to the next connecting point. So there's lots of things in a relationship that will take us away from each other, physical distance, also just going to sleep at night, and then there's difficult things like problem behavior, when we have to discipline. The question is how we keep the attachment through those difficult times. So, let's say my husband's going on a work trip for a couple of days. He'll say to me, okay, honey, I love you, I'll miss you, I'll call you when I land and get to the hotel. And I'll say, okay. So he's bridging our separation to the next point of connection. The next point of connection will be when he arrives at the hotel. And then when he talks to me, then he'll say, okay, I'm going out, I have to go to the clinic tomorrow. I'll call you when I get back to the hotel. So I know each time that we'll be reconnecting. So we want to do the same thing with our kids. We want to point them to the next point, the next connecting point. The difficult part is to do it when we're having discipline issues. So Dr. Neufeld speaks about it as kind of always reassuring that the relationship is okay, that the relationship can handle whatever the difficulty is. So you're having, a huge conflict over something, I don't know, in my house might be how much media time is going on or whether, the dishes are getting done. So what we want to convey is like, we're okay, our relationship is fine, mommy's still here, but I really want you to get those dishes done tonight, So it's just an idea, and then I'm going to come talk to you before bed, and we'll have a chat, or always pointing to the next time. So collecting is how we begin, how we engage, and then bridging is how we maintain the relationship. So we want to bridge whatever could come between the two of us to continue the relationship and keep it strong. Next slide, please. The fourth thing is to really look at the structures and rituals that we have in our family and in our home that support attachment and relationship. So we want to impose limits and put restrictions in place that protect our child's attachment to us. And this is something that I think can be challenging because we have a culture that really, really encourages so much peer time, so much socializing. But we as the parent have the job to say when this is going to be too much for our peers. So we might, let's say a big sleepover is coming up and we know it's going to be tough on our child. They've done it before and it hasn't gone well. Then maybe we plan a weekend trip as a family to somewhere they really want to go that just happens to be on that same weekend. Or if they're getting too much media time and we feel like it's becoming a problem, then we move the computer. We have rules about where the computer is and what time, they can have it, how long they can have it. We plan family dinners together. We have family activities. In Dr. Neufeld's book, he talks about one of his daughters who was they were having a rough patch, and he really felt they needed to reattach. And so they went on a camping trip with no technology, nothing else. And the idea was that she had to depend on him. She had to turn to him, and they needed to reestablish that. So we, again, have the responsibility to make sure that happens. And one of the beautiful examples of this that someone gave is they spent a year in France, in Provence, and they talked about all the rituals there that brought them back together. They said the family sat down for 3 full meals a day together, that every night at the end of dinner, they set the table again for breakfast, pointing to the next time that the family would be together. That every 2 weeks, the whole village would come together for a party where the different generations would mix together and dance and enjoy each other. Even for lunch, the kids came home for a couple hours in the afternoon, so they weren't apart from their parents for the 7 or 8 hours. we don't have a culture that really supports this. We don't have a culture that nurtures relationships between generations and helps us keep our children close to us. So we have to create that. We need to reflect thoughtfully about how we're creating the conditions in our home that will really allow for our child's attachment and relationship and growth. And there's a beautiful writing by Abdu'l-Baha in the Baha'i writings that talks about the role of the parent in creating the conditions in their home for the child's material, physical, and spiritual development. So that is, I think, something to reflect on and think about in our homes. Next slide, please. This one, I think we spoke a little bit about already, just looking at how we safeguard our child's heart, shielding them from wounding experiences. And then if we're finding that they're too defended, that they're not able to be vulnerable, not able to share their feelings with us, melting those defenses with warmth and soft words and caring. Next slide, please. So the last area that I wanted to go over was this whole area of discipline. And it could have really come under how we repair a relationship, but I put it as a separate topic. Can you go to the next slide, Taylor? So the first thing, when we hear the word discipline, at least I do, right away I start thinking about consequences and behavior modification and all these things. But if we look at the root word of what discipline means, it actually means disciplina, meaning instruction and training. So there's a lot more to our role in disciplining our children than just consequencing them. There's this whole idea of creating the conditions in our home. There's the regularity of our patterns of our life that help them to learn discipline. There's all the conversation and consultation and dialogue that we have with our children. All of these things come under the umbrella of discipline. And I think we want to see, what we do in very specific, difficult incidents as a very small category, but really to look at all of the interactions with our child as coming under this umbrella of discipline. Next slide, please. So a few things to think about when we're talking about discipline is looking at how we draw out our child's good intentions. This seems so simple and doesn't, may not seem that important, but if our child has good intentions, they all have good intentions. The question is how we encourage those good intentions, how we cultivate them, how we support and encourage them. I don't know if you've heard the saying, if you shoot for the sun, you get the moon. If you shoot for the moon, you get the eagle. If you shoot the eagle, you get the rock. So we want to encourage our children to aim as high as possible, to try to be their best. But then, of course, we just see that as the first step in the process. We know they're not going to be perfect. But we want to encourage them to get there and then be beside them, accompany them as they get closer and closer to their goal of being the best person that they can, cultivating those characteristics that we want to see. Next slide. The other thing is that when a child comes up against frustration, against futility, against difficulty, they're going to feel sadness. But when they aren't in a good relationship where they can let that sadness out, their defenses come up and they turn to aggression and anger. So a part of our role as a parent is to be the safe place for those tears to come. If you have a child who has a lot of anger and a lot of outbursts and a lot of aggression, it's a good sign that you need to soften them up, and you've done your job when those soft tears come. I don't know if this makes sense. The first time I heard it, I thought it was really an interesting concept. But Dr. Neufeld has this whole kind of wheel of information about what happens when we come up against something difficult and how our tears are really the only option when there's no way to change it. So we want to allow our children to feel that sadness and futility. And then the other thing is we want to encourage them to have mixed feelings about situations. Toddlers who are, let's say 1 to 5, often only have one emotion about something. They're either angry or they're happy or they're sad. But then as they start to hit, 4, 5, 6, 7, they start to have 2 feelings at the same time. One is the feeling of, no, that's my toy and I want it. But then their brain is developing and they start to understand, okay, I want that toy, but there's also this other child that wants that toy. So they start to see from another point of view. And this continues on all through childhood and all through adolescence. So we want to encourage our children to have mixed feelings about things. So they might be really angry at us, or they might be really angry at a teacher, But how do we very gently and kindly encourage them to have another point of view about that situation so that they can see things from more than one perspective? Next slide, please. If we do end up in a situation where, there's a big fight or, a big behavior problem or issue, these are some guidelines that we can try to follow to deal with those incidents. Oh, that's supposed to be address the violation simply, not imply. I don't know how you'd address the violation imply, but so we want to address the violation simply. Often they know what they're doing wrong. Not much needs to be said. But if you do need to say it, then we want to bridge the problem behavior. We want to remind them that we're there, we're going to get through this together. Then we might need to change or control the situation. If it's, siblings fighting, separate them. If it's something going on in public, take them away, whatever it is. And then the fourth one is to set a date to debrief or address the problem. This is so hard to do, but if we can just take the time to cool down, to get our heads about us, to get our emotions under control, and then when our relationship is in a good state to really have a conversation with our child, so much more growth will happen than if we're trying to do it in the middle of emotions being heightened and everybody being, feeling a little bit out of control. So but making sure that we follow up, that we really take the time to have that conversation about the situation. And it might just be a few hours later. It might have to be a whole 24 or 48 hours later, but we wait until we can really have a good, calm conversation. Because if the idea is really growth and transformation of our children, then we want to do it when they're in a state to grow. And we know that when emotions are so high, there's no place to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to ask Nancy if she could please read just a little story that kind of illustrates what we're talking about here.
Sure. And just to let everybody know, we have about 4 or 5 minutes before the Q&A.
Okay, I think there's like one more slide after this, so we're good.
Okay. Is the story coming up?
Hopefully. Taylor has it, I think. You have it, Taylor, or need me to go get it?
I have it. I'm just getting it up on the screen.
Okay, thanks.
Tahirih, we'll give you the extra minute for Taylor looking for it.
Thank you.
Since I'm so on top of our time, don't worry, people. This will not take away from it. It's so interesting.
I can try and just share it maybe if we don't have it.
I don't think so. I can read it as well. Okay. Is this the right one? Cues of Sadness in My Son, Tahirih?
No, it's the other one, The Essence of It All.
Okay.
There you go.
Oh, back to that one. Okay, The Essence of It All by Linda Springer. How do relationships differ, and how does a relationship deliver? I often ask myself this question, wanting to be sure I don't miss the most essential needs of each one of my family. Some relationships between parent and child, husband and wife, friends, seem to merely accommodate one another rather than help give rise to the person's uniqueness or maturity, while other relationships strengthen and empower a person to grow from within. I think the essence is always nurture and protect the core essence of the person in all interactions, in all ways, as much as possible. This became clear to me recently when struggling with an issue with her 21-year-old daughter. I was distressed over a specific thing she did. It turned out it wasn't as bad as I thought, but what I thought had happened left me weak at the knees. I was so upset. I was so tempted to react in the heat of the moment and to say to her, Haven't you learned anything? How could you possibly? What were you thinking? Don't you see that? And on I went. I bit my tongue and I gave it some time. When I was able to collect myself and calm down, I realized that the only thing that would be of any value was to say something that would connect her to her own inner essence. Not what was wrong, but what was right. To give her a vision, a hope, a belief in herself, and to know, and that no, I believed in her. Let her know that I believed in her. This isn't always easy. I decided that given the chance, I would simply say something like, I think you have yet to find your inner strength in this situation, and then hope to open up some dialogue. It took some time to find a place in me from which caring feelings came. And that is so much the reason why we must not react when fire is raging from within. This isn't easy when there are so many reasons to react. Our own frustrations, being stressed, being too focused on the child's behavior, or so many other reasons. It's never the behavior that we're after, ultimately. It's reconnecting that person to their inner essence from which they can emerge. We want to mature their core essence to help it to be birthed. It can be so frustrating when a child is long in coming to that maturity, when it seems it should have reached a long time ago. Yet in the culture we live in, and especially when a child is on socialization track, it leaves a parent to ask, how long? Oh Lord. The sad thing is that many kids at 21 and older are floundering in immaturity and need their parents so badly. Well, culture has moved parent and child apart. We need not only to hold on to our kids, but on to our young adults. This situation with our daughter was again the pivotal one in curbing her from immature behavior to a more mature sense of herself. When I told her, I think you have yet to find your inner strength in this situation, she felt safe enough to agree. She was able to look at herself and say, you're right, Mom. Since this situation has come a long way in our courageously letting go of some of our old ways and situations that were dragging her down. Do you want me to continue to hear her? Yeah.
Sure.
I now have a mental template of how to react in upsetting situations. Wait, let the bad words go through the head, but not through the mouth. When warmth comes into my heart again, contemplate what can be said or done that will nurture the inner essence of the person. Be patient to see how nature will deliver the person to eventual maturity and the natural resolution to the behavior problems. Be grateful to have done no harm. That's beautiful.
So this, sorry, it's a bit long, but it was written from her own words, so I didn't want to edit it too much, but this idea that it can take a long time for our children to reach maturity, but not to become overly focused on the behavior, but to be really focused on the roots of relationship. I think I shared last week this idea that a skilled gardener isn't only thinking about the beautiful flowers or blooms that may come out of a plant, but is focusing its energy on making sure that the roots are deep and secure. So when we're only react in the moment to bad behavior, we can sometimes do more harm than good. So I like this idea of letting the bad words go through your head, but not out of your mouth, trying to keep that. And then the other beautiful concept in that story, I think, is this idea of connecting our children with their inner essence. We have this concept at Nancy Campbell of the nobility of each child. So each child is born noble with these wonderful characteristics of love and kindness and compassion that need to be nurtured and drawn out of them and engaged in service to the community around them. So how can we encourage our children, rather than just saying you did this wrong and I think you should do this, to be reflecting on their own qualities and how they're behaving in a situation, and to be trying to bring those qualities out in different ways. And I was actually, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
No.
I was just going to say that I think one of the things at the school that does that so beautifully is the mentor program. I can remember being at Nancy Campbell and meeting with my mentor, a teacher at the school, and just having some time to think about my own capacities and how I was using them and what I was doing. That really meant so much to me. And I think if we can play that role as parents for our children too, not being somebody that's constantly on top of them, you know, pushing them one way, but helping them to develop that sense within. That's what we want to see, is that maturity from within, so that when they're adults, they're out in the world, they have good judgment, right? Without us necessarily being there. I think there's just one or two more slides, Taylor. I think we lost the slide.
So we have about,
I think it's the end. So this basically is just saying, you know, there's no formulas or prescriptions. This approach isn't one that says, you know, take this step and take that step, but to really look at the love and compassion in our own hearts, and to try to ensure that that relationship with our children is strong and in place. And then I think there was a quote to end, and that's it. And I really want to thank Roya Sadeghi, I don't know if she's on, for helping me make these slides pretty. Oh yes, this quote: "The instruction of these children and youth, I'm sure, is even as the work of a loving gardener who tendeth his young plants in the flowering fields of the all-glorious. There is no doubt that it will yield the desired results." So again, this idea of raising our children, creating the conditions, the soil, the sun, the love, the compassion that will help our youth to grow into beautiful adults. Okay, thank you.
if you can, you don't need to screen share, and I'll do my little, oh, I see it's off. Thank you. So I have the questions before me, actually, that are just from my text messages. So if you do have questions, please take this moment to fill them in the chat. And we remember that you will see them after on our Q&A. But for now, Tahirih, I think we have time for one and maybe two. One gentleman has said, last week you taught us that it's never too late to connect. Can you provide some examples of how to build attachment with our adult children? I am a man who was seldom home when raising my children. I'm in my 60s and 70s before I really began to appreciate what being a parent was. At the same time, I'm expected to be a grandparent, and I can't help but notice my children seemed to think I'm a better grandfather than a father. How can I become a more attached, better father to my children?
I think that's a beautiful question. And I think the very first thing is to want to have that role in your children's life. Dr. Neufeld speaks about a yearning to have right relationship with our children, and our children can sense that. And in fact, it might be that they're feeling safe enough with you and vulnerable enough to be able to express that they want to be close to you, that they want you to be a strong father figure for them. I think the other thing, I'm not sure if you were at the last class, at the last webinar, but we sort of looked at examples of how to deepen the roots of attachment in all different ways. The simplest way, of course, is just to care for them. I have my lovely mother-in-law staying with us. The poor woman came for 2 weeks for a visit and got stuck here for the last 3 or 4 months because she lives in Europe. But every morning, no matter what, she makes my husband and I this lovely green ginger tea. And, I'm running around with 4 children and trying to stuff some breakfast down my throat as I can. But she has this lovely tea and she brings it to me every morning. And it's just the simplest act, but it's so kind and really symbolic of her caring and her love for us. So any small actions of kindness and caring, of providing, we talked last week about this concept of the provision being greater than the pursuit. So we always want to kind of trump whatever's being asked for. And my dear father is a beautiful example of this. We would have birthdays for my twins where they might ask for, a new toy or a new doll. And one birthday he showed up with a pool for the backyard, like a huge full-on above ground pool. So he takes whatever is asked and then trumps it by so much. So I'm sure everybody has examples of being able to do this, but that's the idea of attachment and love and sacrifice for our children.